This video is about values and objectivity in science, and in particular the social sciences, although we'll sort of touch on some of the other ones. So the question we're facing is, should science be value-free? That is, should scientists, in their role as scientists, avoid making claims or assumptions about what's good or bad or what we ought to do and so on? On one popular view of science and its role in society, the job of science is to tell us the way things are, how, out there in the observable world. And its job is not to tell us which parts of the world are good or bad or what we ought to do within it. Just to motivate this, let's look at a couple of examples. So have you ever heard of the disease called onanism? Well, if not, it's really terrible. Symptoms include mental and physical exhaustion, blindness, and a general inability to function. The cause? Masturbation. We now know, of course, that that's not true, but it was for a long time in medical scientific books that this is a disease that you can have, and you can actually still buy this book. Now it's treated, of course, as a historical text rather than as a scientific or medical one. But this seems like a clear example in which researchers' values, in this case moral and religious values, were very clearly influencing their work, coloring their perceptions of the observable evidence. And I think we can find some sort of straightforward, explicit examples of that as well. Consider, for example, that being gay was considered a pathology. It was in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the sort of Bible of psychopathologies, until sometime in the 70s. And in this case, again, it seems very clear that the sort of moral or religious values were distorting researchers' perceptions of what's going on. Sometimes, though, the influence of values in scientific research is a little more subtle. For a long time, primatologists thought that the social structures in other primate species were heavily male-dominated. The picture was one in which, basically, the males competed for resources and mates, whereas the females were more or less passive. They looked for food, they take care of babies, but that's kind of it. These days, females are thought to be much more active, to play very active roles in their social groups. Donna Haraway published this book where she documents the change in primatological theory. And she argues that this shift in theory happened after and because of an increase in the number of women in the field. Historically, the field had been populated mostly, if not exclusively, by men. And when women started doing more primatology too, they brought in a different perspective, a different set of assumptions. And she thinks that what happened here was that actually the men had certain assumptions both about how males and females do relate, but also about how they should. And these background assumptions were actually an important limitation on the researcher's ability to understand what was actually going on in these other primates. So what is it that unifies these examples? What's going on? It seems like one way of thinking about it is in terms of objectivity. The concern about researchers' values playing a role here comes from a worry that the influence of values is a distortion. It's making people not objective. But what is objectivity anyways? I love this quote. This comes from a paper by Heather Douglas, a philosopher of science. Objectivity is one of the most frequently invoked and yet vaguely defined concepts in the philosophy of science. Clearly, objectivity is some kind of epistemic ideal. To call something objective is clearly to praise it or endorse it, to recommend it to others, recommend that they endorse it as well. We might say something like, this person is objective, or this method is objective, and so I trust them. How can this be fleshed out? What does it mean to be objective? In a different paper, Heather Douglas actually goes through 8 different senses of the term objective that she finds in the literature on science. So not just how the word objective is used in general across the board, but specifically about science. There are at least 8 different ways that people use the word. Now, if this were a real philosophy of science class, I would torture you by going through all of them. But for present purposes, I think we can focus on just these 2. It seems to me that the most common ways that people talk about science being objective or failing to be have to do with 3 and 4. So to be value-free means, like we've been saying, there's just no role for values in science. The evaluative claims and assumptions are simply not made. Value neutral is like that, only you can kind of make certain claims or assumptions about value, but you have to be kind of fair and balanced between them. You're not picking sides when there's disagreement or controversy over some evaluative claim. And I think these might be good things in some contexts, but value-free or value-neutral conceptions of objectivity, I think, are just kind of irrelevant to the social sciences. I think scientists' values can and should influence certain things like questions about what to study, right? Aspiring scientists have to decide which field to go into, which kinds of questions to research. Funding agencies have to make similar decisions about where to spend money. And in practice, obviously, the way we choose is on the basis of what we value. And that seems like the right thing to do. We should dedicate our resources to researching, things that advance our ethical aims, like curing diseases or understanding sources of prejudice or what have you. Scientists' values can also constrain the kinds of work that they do. These images are from the famous Milgram experiments on obedience. Experiments that, frankly, showed something really interesting and important about the human mind. And yet, we now think probably we're not ethical, and so we choose not to do these kinds of studies because of our values. Scientists' values should influence their work in some ways. Evaluative considerations can motivate research, guide it to certain topics, constrain it. But you still might think scientists' values should not play any role in the science itself. That is, our values can kind of tell us where to shine the spotlight, but then they shouldn't color what we see when we shine that light on something. Once the scientific work has begun, our values should not influence our reasoning. I actually think this is also a mistake. And the reason has to do with inductive risk. This is another point I owe to Heather Douglas. So the idea of inductive risk is that when we make an inference based off of limited evidence, as we always do in science, we're balancing two possible ways of going wrong. The first is a false positive. We falsely conclude that something is true when it's really not. The other is a false negative. We falsely conclude that something is not true when it really is. Notice that whenever we go out and collect data and make an inference based off of our limited evidence, we are trying to balance these two things. And the way that we do that often is heavily influenced by our values. A couple of intuitive examples. In the courtroom, supposedly, the way things are set up is to minimize false positives. A false positive in the courtroom means convicting an innocent person. The person is not guilty, but if we falsely think that they are guilty, then we'll be sending an innocent person to jail. That's why the standards of evidence in a courtroom for a criminal case are beyond reasonable doubt. You have to get the entire group of jurors to think that there is no possible reasonable doubt that the person is guilty. That is really leaning heavily on minimizing those false positives. And that's for ethical reasons, because we think it's worse to send an innocent person to jail than to let somebody guilty go free. Another example on the opposite side is in the doctor's office. So often in the doctor's office, we really want to minimize false negatives. False negative in this case would be concluding falsely that the symptoms are not indicators of, for example, some really serious condition. So it's possible that this set of symptoms is indicating that the person has, let's say, cancer, but it's also possible that it indicates something much more mild. Well, a false negative would be to say, it's probably not the serious thing, when that is in fact the serious thing. So there we're going to be much more likely to run a whole bunch of tests and to just be really, really, really sure that the really horrible thing is not the case, right? So two clear cases from ordinary kinds of, non-scientific examples where our values shape the way that we manage inductive risk. And we face all kinds of similar questions in science too. For example, suppose we're developing a new intervention to try and reduce some outcome. And we have some evidence that it works, but also maybe a little bit of evidence that it doesn't. We're having now to balance it. Do we conclude that it does work and risk a false positive? Or do we conclude that it doesn't work and risk a false negative? How we play that game of managing that balance probably is going to depend on what it's an intervention to reduce. Is it to reduce something we think would be really, really good to reduce? Well, then maybe we're going to lean a little more on thinking that this is probably an effective intervention, or that it could be and it's worth pursuing. Now we're risking that false positive a little more than we might if it were an intervention to reduce something we don't especially care about. Another reason to think that values ought to play a role in scientific research, particularly social scientific research, has to do with a distinction that philosophers sometimes make between two kinds of evaluative concepts. Philosophers will sometimes talk about thin evaluative concepts. These are good, bad, right, wrong, that kind of thing, where the content of the concept is purely evaluative. There's no descriptive content to those concepts. In contrast, we have thick evaluative or ethical concepts, which include things like courage or aggression or well-being, where the idea here is the concept has both evaluative and descriptive content. So courage, for example, you could maybe try to define purely descriptively by saying it's a willingness to face danger. But of course, if somebody faced danger very willingly by just walking off a cliff for no reason, we wouldn't call that courageous. So it seems like courage has to be something more like a willingness to face danger when there's a good reason to do so, or when the cause is just, or something like that, right? There's some evaluative content there. And same actually with aggression and well-being. These are concepts that social scientists work with. These are the sorts of things that we study. So if the very concepts of the phenomena in question are themselves partly evaluative, well then obviously a social scientist simply can't avoid making evaluative claims and assumptions. So coming back to these 8 understandings of objectivity, it seems clear that we can't focus on 3 or 4, but maybe some of these other senses of objectivity are the relevant ones for social science. Maybe these are the ideals that we should be pursuing. I'm going to argue specifically that we should be focused on interactive objectivity. This is the kind of objectivity that I think is most important for social science. And it's the kind of objectivity that's attained when open discussion and debate leads to a consensus, or maybe a near consensus. When people converge from very different points of view on a similar idea, that provides some evidence that it's not merely subjective, in whatever sense that means, but rather something more trustworthy. And this idea actually comes from a book by Helen Longino. She thinks there are 4 ways of getting more interactive objectivity. You need recognized avenues for criticism, shared standards for arguments on which those criticisms are based, general responsiveness to criticism, and equal distribution of intellectual authority. Right? The idea is we all come together and we discuss and we debate. We're totally transparent about what we're doing, and if people think there's a mistake, they can say so. There's a set of standards that we all kind of adopt. There's some common ground that we can use to decide whether or not this is a good criticism. The people who originally proposed the idea are open to that criticism and are responsive to it. And they don't necessarily have to say, if you're criticizing it, then I guess I'll back off. They can stick to their guns, but then we're going to have this productive discussion and debate because we have an equal distribution of intellectual authority. Nobody gets to be the person who declares the way things are. We all get to interact in this way, and if we all tend to converge on something, well then that provides some evidence of its objectivity. So what would this mean? What would it look like if scientists actually embraced the evaluative character of their work? Well, I think for one thing, we would make these value judgments more openly so that they can be criticized. I think these evaluative claims and assumptions should be presented publicly with as much transparency as possible and then defended, revised, or abandoned in the face of criticism. This would enable dissenting voices to be raised. If the research misses something important or if it focuses on something that people don't have reason to care about, well, then people should be able to speak up and say so. This would also encourage researchers to be more reflective and self-critical when they make these kinds of evaluative judgments. Covering them up just keeps them from being refined. Right? If I'm right about the way that values pervade this research, well then it's gonna happen regardless of whether or not we say so. So we had better bring them to light. Right? And I think we should bring them to light not in a way that's like a disclosure statement, where you say, like you have a financial or conflict of interest disclosure. Right? No, you don't disclose that you conducted a t-test or a regression. You declare that. It's just part of the methods that you need to know if you want to understand this study. And I think we should do the same thing with our claims and assumptions about value. Second thing I think we might need to do is change the way that we develop new measures. Right? So typically we validate measures empirically, meaning we try to make the case that this measure actually measures the thing it's supposed to. But I think we should also be trying to show that they measure things that are worth caring about, right? Finally, I think we really need to have more interdisciplinary collaboration. Scientists need to know something about statistics in order to do their work. Well, they don't need to be experts, but they need to know the basics, and they can consult with quantitative specialists when necessary. And I think an analogous point applies with respect to philosophy and other humanities. While social scientists don't need to be experts in the evaluative questions, they do need to know the basics, and they should consult with humanists when it's helpful to do so. All right, so I've covered a lot of stuff here, but now I have some questions for you. What roles do you see, whether good or bad, for researchers' values in science, and maybe social science in particular? What does or should objectivity look like in science? Another way of thinking of that is, what ideal of objectivity should scientists strive for? I'd really love to hear people's thoughts on these questions.